Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, I apologize for my inadvertent discourtesy in arriving late and in interrupting Robin's talk. But the fact is, I was trying to solve the crisis that my talk is locked inside my computer and I couldn't get it out. So I had to get a version of it sent to me from Budapest by internet. So thank you. My apologies for that. Now, I want to talk on two topics really here. The first is what I would call nationalism in the light of the Ukraine crisis. And the second is, are there kinds of nationalism which are dangerous? Are there kinds of nationalism which are pacific? Well, first of all, the current crisis, the current discussions of nationalism are affected adversely by the Ukraine crisis. And this has been the case particularly since 2014, when Mr. Putin moved into eastern Ukraine, but also there's been a longer development of hostility to nationalism in intellectual circles and government circles, and all of the circles that were being described a moment ago by my colleague. We call them in England the great and the good. They are often great, they are sometimes good. But we've been exposed really in the last few years to the following kinds of things. Incessant anti-fascist propaganda from Moscow, baseless claims of attacks against Russians in the Ukraine, incitement of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine to break away, Russian troops without insignia seizing official buildings in the Crimea, a stage-managed illegal plebiscites in the Crimea before and today, or this week rather, in Donetsk and Luhansk. Assurances from President Putin that he had no further territorial designs in Europe, though, alas, he might be forced to intervene to protect ethnic Russians. It all has disturbing rings of the 1930s. Isn't that where nationalism leads, to fascism and war? Well, that's obviously the most common establishment and intellectual interpretation of Europe's recent crises. It's also Mr. Putin's interpretation of events in Ukraine, which he blames on the neo-fascist followers of the nationalist leader Stefan Bandera, who was murdered by the KGB in 1959. But this view, whether expressed by Putin or his critics in the EU and Washington, is really too simple by half. Nationalists are certainly implicated in the Ukraine crisis, but more as victims than as perpetrators. The crisis began as an attempt by Moscow to rescue its stillborn concept of a Eurasian Economic Union by forcing Ukraine to join it and to reject associate membership of the EU. Mr. Putin, who isn't a nationalist, I'll come on to that, but the ruler of a shaky multinational empire hostile to nationalism, sparked off the crisis by closing Russian borders to Ukraine's agricultural exports. That is the real beginning of the crisis in 2014. It didn't begin with the battle, with the events in the Maidan. It began with that. That was the very first act that was taken by Russia. Putin did this to compel a reluctant President Yanukovych to abandon what was the more popular trade option in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government, encouraged by Putin, unified the assorted Democrats, nationalists and activists of the left and right who protested Putin's move by firing indiscriminately on them. Mr. Yanukovych's power crumbled almost visibly. He fled. A new Ukrainian government which includes nationalists, took over. Nationalism was thus one impulse in this general movement by the Ukrainians. Others were love of freedom, desire for a more democratic system, economic hopes for a better prosperity through ties to Western Europe, and in a way, simple human decency. The Ukrainians, inspired by these various aims, may have just sustained a defeat originally sustained defeats, but they have regained territory. They govern most of Ukraine, and it seems that whatever else happens, Ukraine will now escape more or less permanently, or most of Ukraine, from Moscow's post-Soviet domination. While that remains the case, Mr. Putin has suffered a reverse overall. But if Ukrainian nationalists have been, in a sense, slandered in this crisis, what about Mr. Putin himself? His objectionable, ruthless, aggressive, deceitful, illegal, repressive, subversive, but to describe them as nationalist is to reduce the concept of nationalism to a politics of aggressive self-assertion. There is no reason to suppose that nations and nation-states are more prone to indulge in such folly than are federations, empires, or states founded on non-national principles. Mr. Putin has indeed acted ruthlessly, but he has done so in the service of what he sees as clear state interest, some personal interest, not from a commitment to Russian peoplehood. He doesn't run a national state, he runs a multinational empire. The history of the 1930s is instructive for making the necessary distinctions here. World War II began as the result of a conspiracy by Hitler and Stalin, the Nazi-Soviet pact, to invade Poland and to divide Eastern Europe and the Baltic states between them. Nazi Germany was a state built upon the ideology of racial nationalism, which places race above nationhood, and the Soviet Union was a state based upon the ideology of proletarian internationalism, which prefers social class to national loyalty. Both those states acted far more brutally and unrestrainedly than any conventional nation-state of the period. And as Margaret Thatcher said once, when she was told that nationalism had been the inspiration, national loyalty, national sympathy, had been the inspiration behind the Russian and China and German attacks, she replied, she thought nationalism rather had been what inspired people in those countries to resist the Nazis and the communists over the 6-year period. As I've said, there is also the case that the Russian Federation, as its name suggests, is not a nation state but an empire. In addition to being aggressive, Mr. Putin might best be described as imperialist or neo-imperialist, not nationalist, defending the interests of a state, Russia, the Russian Federation, which has never accepted that its neo-imperial role will have to be surrendered in the modern world. We should not illegitimately associate the nation-state with crimes that are not uniquely nationalist and may even be less likely to be committed by stable nation-states. This matters because nationalism is an increasingly necessary word that is too often used as a word of attack. Nationalisms and nationalist movements are popping up all over Europe and the world. They can take very different forms, left, right, and ideologically ambivalent or mysterious. Some are straightforward throughout Europe, some are straightforward secessionist movements, like the nationalist parties in Scotland and Catalonia, striving to break away to establish new states rooted in historic peoplehood. Others are movements resisting further integration of their existing nation-states into the European Union, such as the True Finns party in Poland, or in effect today, the British government, previously the Brexit party and UKIP. Still others want to protect the nation and its distinctive political spirit. The National Front in France, or the welfare state in Denmark, or the liberal values in Holland, the party of the right, the various parties of the right, which feel that the spirit of Holland, the social arrangements of Holland, are threatened by mass immigration. Even the very cautious Germans had their own Alternative for Germany party, which was not initially nationalistic. It might have been better described as the alliance of patriotic German bankers, because they were really concerned more about economic effects of the EU than anything else, and of the euro. And which anyway has effectively, like the Swedish Democrats, been kept away from any kind of power. Many of the parties we call populist or nationalist or authoritarian or whatever didn't exist 25, 30 years ago. And they are now represented in Europe's parliaments. They have just done well in Sweden and in Italy, and they significantly advanced in 2014 and didn't increase, but they did maintain their advance in 2019. They may not, all of them, win power or enter government, even as sharing government, but they force, and they are forcing, mainstream parties to deal with such issues as the sense of a loss of sovereignty. In the eyes of Europe's various political and cultural establishments, none of this should be happening. It is akin to water running uphill. For several decades, we have heard from these bodies, from these people, that the nation state is inevitably on its way out, losing power upwards to supranational institutions and downward to organized minority groups. Behind their hands, the critics of resurgent nationalism murmur that it is nothing but xenophobia, authoritarianism, or even fascism, in folkloric drag on occasion. They see Europe's rising nationalist parties as the preserve of bitter losers or those in the grip of nostalgia. The former president of the, excuse me, the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, expressed this view perfectly a decade ago when he said, for the umpteenth time, the nation state was dead, adding, "The biggest enemy of Europe today is fear. Fear leads to egoism, egoism leads to nationalism, and nationalism leads to war." That is a complete parody of the various issues from the difficulties faced by the euro, to the immigration crisis of 2015, and to the general crisis of credibility, of legitimacy that plagued the EU in the next 10 years. Now, obviously, Mr. Van Rompuy didn't foresee Mr. Putin's actions, but what he said illustrates nicely how European political elites see events like the Ukraine crisis through a distorting mirror. This view persuades them to consider nationalism a threat but a dying one, and it is quite simply wrong on both counts. A practical refutation of that view lies in the fact there are now more nation states in the world today than ever before. They have multiplied since 1945 in two great leaps forward: the decolonization period of the 50s and the 60s, and the years following the dissolution of communism in 89 and 91. Some of these nations gained their independence, alas, by war and revolution. Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, in your part of the world, did so. Others did so by peaceful negotiation. Most former British colonies and Soviet republics took this route, but the most significant example of it, really, is the velvet divorce that divided Czechoslovakia into two successful states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Now, this upsurge of nationalism in several continents and in very different social circumstances might be dismissed as a detour on the high road to global governance if the establishment view of nationalism weren't so absurdly crude. It elides vital distinctions and treats all forms of national loyalty as if they were the most aggressive and exclusivist type. In reality, the full spectrum of national loyalties runs roughly as follows: from Nazism, which is totalitarian racial nationalism, to fascism, which is authoritarian and aggressive nationalism, to ethnic nationalism, which is exclusivist, treating ethnic minorities as second-class citizens, if that, to civic nationalism, which opens full citizenship to all born in the national territory in return for their loyalty to the state, for the nation-state, and its institutions. And finally, that patriotism, which is the same national loyalty, plus simple love of country, its scenery, its sights, its sounds, its characteristic architecture, its songs and its poems, its people, its wonderful familiarity. Here, for example, is Orwell, perhaps the most famous critic of nationalism, on returning to southern England from Spain. He was coming back from the Civil War there. Down here, it was still the England I had known in my childhood. The railway cuttings smothered in wildflowers, the deep meadows where the great shining horses browse and meditate, the slow-moving streams bordered by willows, the green bosoms of outer London, the barges on the river, the familiar streets, the posters telling of cricket matches and royal weddings, the men in bowler hats, the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, the red buses, the blue policemen, all deep sleeping the deep, deep sleep of England, a deep sleep which he lamented because he felt, of course, that Nazism was on the way to attack it. England, of course, has changed dramatically since then. Men no longer wear bowler hats. But it would be absurd to condemn the kind of patriotism Orwell was talking about as likely to lead to fascism, as it would be to abstain from all interest in sex on the grounds that it might lead to promiscuity or divorce. Ordinary people, attached to reality as they must be to survive, feel exactly that sense of absurdity when they hear statements like Mr. Van Rompuy's. But that hasn't hitherto affected their political behavior. Why have ordinary people, since I think the turn of the century, begun to voting and thinking and voting in line with those Orwellian sentiments? One obvious reason is that all the ideological rivals to patriotism have been largely discredited. Orwell pointed out in his essay on nationalism that those who abandoned nationalism generally adopted a more virulent ideological substitute. In our day, the most obvious rival ideologies are Europeanism in Europe and multiculturalism in the United States, both of which seek to challenge national patriotism and weaken it in order to change the political character of their societies. The political character in many respects, but particularly in the respect that they are almost equally critical of conventional Western democracy as they are of nationalism itself. Neither multiculturalism nor Europeanism has yet developed strong, loyal attachments in the community of each country. But, of course, they do enjoy lavish official support and the sympathy of government officials, international bureaucrats, NGO executives, what Sam Huntington called denationalized corporate managers, and academics anxious to be in the vanguard of new or transformed nations. This is, in fact, a form of what Lenin and others called vanguard politics. It is a nationally, Europeanism and multiculturalism are the vanguard politics of the international bureaucratic and indeed national bureaucratic elites, the cultural, media and political establishments in almost all countries. But it hasn't taken in any one country in the mass of the population. Something demonstrated most dramatically by Brexit, which was a rejection of the concept of Europeanism as much as it was an expression of populism or other discontents. Consequently, old-fashioned patriotism survives, even weakened by defections, but not seriously challenged. I would say one can see that nationalism remains in the shadows until tempted onto the stage by 9/11 or an anniversary of D-Day or a funeral of the Queen. The Queen's funeral is one of the most interesting recent cases. The Queen Mother's funeral, by the way, 20 years ago almost, this had the same effect, but it had the effect of making an enormous number of citizens feel a sense of loyalty, which they had never consciously rejected, and which remain in their personality, but nonetheless was not given any encouragement by official organizations, by governments, by the theories of government, and yet was latent, was somnolent, until an event like the Queen's death reminded them of who they were and why they felt strongly about being who they were. Until recently, voters for whom patriotism and the national interest were determining issues, and there were some, they found, until the last 20 years, really, they found comfortable homes in parties of left and right. You could not say that nationalism was a partisan thing. It wasn't a left wing or a right wing thing. It was a national thing, and that has gradually ceased to be true. The French political theorist Pierre Manon expressed this most interestingly when he said that the parties of the left had abandoned their natural constituency, which was social class, and the parties of the right had abandoned their national constituency, which was the nation, in order to advance the interests of the European Union, to which the political leaderships felt the primary loyalty, which is very understandable, given that politicians who leave national politics to become active within the European Union find themselves, not only with the improved personal circumstances that Mario described, but also they find themselves in positions which, as political leaders in small nations, they would never have had the power that they now exercise. And so, in a sense, you can understand why political elites become the vanguard representatives of Europeanism, or in the States, multiculturalism. It is a very good career move on the one hand, but it is also a feeling that their countries, small countries, can have more influence in the world through this channel. We might go on to discuss why that's a mistake, but nonetheless, it's a powerful feeling. As the parties of the left swapped their working class identity for that of middle class liberalism, they began to think, the political leaders began to think nationalism vulgar, cheap, and xenophobic. At the same time, mainstream parties of the right drifted unthinkingly into a posture that treated nationalist and socially conservative voters as somewhat embarrassing elderly relatives whose views could be safely ignored. They wouldn't be around too long. Party leaders also, on both sides, reasoned that their voters really had nowhere else to go. The result can be seen most dramatically in Britain, where the UK Independence Party, in its brief life, first secured a base among traditional middle-class Tories, then moved into working-class Labour voters, and then, in that case, threatened both parties with losing the constituencies they had taken for granted. And I think one can see similar things throughout Europe, not universally, but in a lot of countries. Another factor in this resurgence of national feeling is a change of intellectual fashion towards bigness. Fewer people in all social classes are still confident that the future necessarily belongs to the big battalions. Economists have noted that smaller states are likely to be richer, easier to manage, and closer to the people than larger states. As The Economist magazine pointed out a few years ago, of the 10 countries with populations of over 100 million, only the US and Japan are prosperous. Once you realize that bigness does not bring prosperity, you remove an important obstacle to people becoming secessionists. That, I think, is part of the explanation of what's happening in Catalonia and Scotland. And what's also happening now in Scotland, I can't speak, what's also happening in Scotland is a gradual realization that independence from the United Kingdom would actually mean a fall in their living standards, because the Scottish economy is heavily subsidized by London and by the overall UK taxpayer. That, as I say, removes an important obstacle to the argument that bigness is not necessarily prosperity removes an important obstacle to secession. But when it becomes clear that in any particular case secession will mean less prosperity, the voters get a different point of view. But if ever there was a link between prosperity and bigness, it's been dissolved by free trade and globalization, which ensure that the rise of the nation, the size of the nation, need no longer coincide with the size of the market open to it. At the same time, in those circumstances, a government can shrink to the size that its citizens find most convenient to control. Now, as I mentioned, the US is the exception to these rules. It is both large and prosperous because it is a federal system which distributes power to states and localities where it can be better controlled. Switzerland is another case. And Switzerland, of course, is resistant to joining the EU. Europe might imitate America's success if it were to model itself on Switzerland and distribute power downward, but the opposite is happening in Europe, and as it happens also in America. A final brief argument is perhaps the strongest. Nation-states are an almost necessary basis for democracy. A common language and culture, a common allegiance to national institutions, a common sense of destiny within excuse me, in the country, all within a defined territory with equal rights for all citizens. These seem to be the conditions that enable people with different interests and opinions to accept political defeat and the passage of laws to which they object. There are few exceptions to this rule, India and Switzerland, but many more confirmations of it. None of these many considerations justify supporting nationalism as a universal principle of statehood. There is no such principle. States rooted in ideas as different as popular consent and the dynastic principle have been handed down to us by history. Wholesale reconstruction of them is utopian and nearly always fails. The best we can hope for in all political systems is to hope to improve them by piecemeal reform in line with the grain of their history. So trying to abolish or replace the nation state is almost certain to produce more evils than it deters. The lesson of recent history is that nationalism is here to stay, and that secure, stable, and satisfied nation-states are likely to want friendship with neighboring countries rather than their conquest. That is the aim of non-nation states like Russia and I would say China. Wise political leaders anxious for peace will concentrate on shaping their people's nationalism into an amiable patriotism rather than submerging it in a new sovereignty and driving it towards the darker manifestations of young and aggressive nationalisms. Now, that's the bulk of what I have to say. How much longer do I have, if any time at all? well, in that case, I'd like to say a little bit about the nature of American nationalism. Broadly speaking, I would say there are three types of nationalisms. The first is straightforward ethnic nationalism, in which case think of a country which is actually geographically remote from anywhere, which doesn't have many people coming to stay there, and which, or even to visit, and which therefore all its people marry one another, they speak the same language, they are genuinely an independent kind of nationality. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with such a state, but I think it probably, that kind of a purely ethnic nationalism is going to be very difficult for anyone to sustain in the modern world. And the reason for that is that is easy, cheap air travel. People who can live in one country and go back home at regular intervals. Excuse me. An international media which brings us news of home wherever we are. And which means that therefore it's difficult to dilute our old identity and submerge ourselves in, it's difficult to retain our old identity of foreign influences. And as a result of that, most people have come to think that a state which tries to maintain a purely ethnic identity in these circumstances is largely mistaken, won't succeed, and insofar as it uses law and custom to prevent the assimilation of newcomers, and it was even hostile to them, it is unattractive and unappealing, and we should try to avoid it. Now, the second kind of nationalism is what I would call cultural nationalism. And that is to say, a nation is an ethno-cultural unit, and this is what a civic nationalism emphasizes rather the loyalty, the openness of the nation state to newcomers, and secondly, its embrace of them, and therefore a corresponding loyalty on the part of the new citizens. And that is the situation of most, that is the description of civic nationalism of ethno-cultural nations, which is true in most, they are most of the nations in today's world. And there is a third, very important group of nations, which, some of which are multi-ethnic, which are held together, in principle, by philosophical considerations. Obviously, the examples include the Soviet Union, which is an ideological nationalism, which was hostile to ethno-nationalism, and also, interestingly, the United States, because the United States is seen by many of the people who embrace it, as, and others too, as a country held together not by cultural familiarity, not by the fact that you grew up in a country, everybody feels like an American as a result of living together for a long time, but is held together by their commitment to political ideals. Now, that was expressed, I imagine, is the name Bono, the pop singer, mean anything to people here? Well, Bono recently said, Bono said, America is not just a country. It's an idea. Now, I didn't choose this quotation to suggest that this view of America is a kind of pop opinion. It just happened that in my Google search, his name came up ahead of George Will, Irving Kristol, and many distinguished political theorists, all of whom have described America as either an idea or linked idea as a proposition nation, namely a nation dedicated to the proposition of freedom and equality, to distinguish it from what they're always called blood and soil dynastic realms. This philosophical definition of America is the conventional wisdom in America of left and right, at least among people who write and talk of such things. In fact, we've heard this, the idea that America is an idea, not a nation, so many times that we fail to realize how paradoxical it is. Listen to how it sounds when we reverse it. America is not just an idea, it is a nation. Surely that has the ring of truth and common sense, much more than the Bono statement. For a nation is plainly something more larger, more complex and richer than an idea. A nation may include ideas. It may have evolved under the influence of a particular set of ideas, but also of many other things: laws, institutions, language, loyalties, stories, the songs of the people, and above all, what Abraham Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory. The nation becomes more than an idea with every election, every battle, every heroic deed, every historical moment that millions share. Now, that's not to deny that America was founded on some very explicit political ideas, notably liberty and equality, which Jefferson helpfully wrote down in the Declaration of Independence. To be founded on an idea, however, is not the same thing as actually being an idea. A political idea is not a destination or a conclusion, but the starting point of an evolution. And in the case of the US, not really a starting point either. The ideas in the Declaration on which the US was founded were not original to the country, but drawn from the Anglo-Scottish tradition of Whiggish liberalism. Not only were those ideas circulating in America well long before the Revolution, but when the revolutionaries won, they succeeded not to a legal and political wasteland, but to the institutions, traditions, and practices of colonial America, which they then reformed rather than abolishing entirely. We won't be far wrong if we think of 1776 as universalizing the liberalism of Britain's 1688 Glorious Revolution and extending the blessings of liberty from the British people to all mankind in principle, at least anyone who actually made it to the United States. Geography then came to the assistance of philosophy. American liberty was implemented not in a small, crowded island, divided by hedgerows and ancient landmarks, but in the fruited plains of a vast continent. The opportunities it offered to liberty and property were much easier to seize and exploit in this newfound land than in a country where property registration dated back to 1066 and the Doomsday Book. America's founding ideas, equality as well as liberty, flourished more vigorously here than in their native habitat because there was more room, fewer obstacles, and a political nation that shared more or less the same broad political, moral, religious, and democratic outlook, especially after the Tory loyalists to the king had been driven out to Canada. Admittedly, there are always going to be serious disagreements within a national consensus. And in the case of slavery, an original sin that still scars America, the passage of the US Constitution managed them more or less effectively until the Civil War. In fact, one of the founding fathers, John Jay, pointed out that Americans were fortunate in starting out with the same Protestant religion, the same language, and the same institutions from the first, which, as I say, they had reformed, not abolished. Given the spread of newspapers, railways, and democratic debate, that broad common culture would intensify the sense of a common American identity over time. It was a cultural identity, much more than an ethnic one, and one heavily qualified by regional loyalties. But Americans increasingly felt American when dealing with Canadians, with the British and other Europeans. American enough, that is, to be enthusiastic about fighting those damn foreigners. The American identity at times has seemed likely to become an ethnic one, but it hasn't done so because of the successive waves of immigration that brought other ethnicities into the American nation, and they required time to assimilate. That early American identity, however, was robust enough to welcome these new arrivals and to transform them into Americans. This wasn't an easygoing or uncomplicated matter. America's emerging cultural identity was stretched by the arrivals of millions of new people from different cultures. The US government, to deal with this, the US government, private industry, and charitable organizations all set out self-consciously, seriously, and vigorously to Americanize these new arrivals. That was a great historical achievement, and it helped to create a new America that was, in many respects, the old America in all essential respects. Samuel Huntington, in his great book, Who Are We?, employed the metaphor of tomato soup. He said the original American nation was like tomato soup, with every arrival of people from a different culture, from the Spanish culture, from the Polish culture, from France, and so on. A different set of spices was added to the tomato soup. At the end of the day, you had a very rich and interesting tomato soup, but it was still tomato soup. And I think that that's the, excuse me, that is one of the, yes, that is one of the, that is a cultural nation developing rather than a philosophical one. Still, Americanization ran up against a practical problem. It required the immigrants to surrender something. Notably, they had to learn a new language and to give up many aspects of their old culture. But until the second generation, and so that meant until the second generation, many immigrants were not culturally American in a full sense. So there was anxiety that they would import cultural qualities from their previous homes. This meant the authorities and other Americans had to find a simple, straightforward way of ascertaining the sentiments of newcomers. The American creed, which is the philosophical distillation of America rather than its full lived reality, was what was produced. On the eve of a visit to America in the 1920s, G.K. Chesterton noticed that his visa application required that he answer such questions as whether he was an anarchist. He commented that this question appears on no British forms, but it is not only because most of the Englishmen are not anarchists, it is even more because even the anarchists are Englishmen. It might be maintained that Herbert Spencer was an anarchist. It is certain that Auberon Herbert was an anarchist. But Spencer was an extraordinary, typical Englishman of the nonconformist middle class. And Herbert was an extraordinary, typical English aristocrat of the old and genuine aristocracy. Everyone in England knew that the squire would never throw a bomb at the Queen, and that a nonconformist would never throw a bomb at anyone. Now, Chesterton was touched by the confidence of the official form in America that an anarchist bent on overthrowing the government would candidly confess this to the immigration authorities. But he conceded there was an underlying philosophical justification for it. If you don't know what your neighbor is like, in a basic sense, because he's a mysterious stranger, you have to find out, or risk meeting with a nasty surprise in the form of an anarchist bomb. Such questions are intended not only, however, futilely, not only to deter the anarchist, but also to give everyone else the incentive to demonstrate loyalty to his new nation, its values and its customs. It worked out in ways we now suggest. I'm going to mention one. Well, one was the way the Catholic Church originally had a hostile relationship with America, which was because the Americans thought the Catholic immigrants were loyal to a sovereign abroad, namely the Pope, and the Catholics faced discrimination. The fact of the matter, however, is that what changed the Catholic Church in America, and it did change it, what changed the Catholic Church worldwide was the American Catholic Church. And that changed because of two things. The lived experience of American liberty by Irish and other Catholic immigrants, and the pressure from non-Catholic Americans that they should demonstrate their attachment to America and its free institutions. Enforcing the American idea is not always a nice business, even when it's a necessary one. But by World War II, all of the most recent immigrants had become culturally American. So when American commandos in the Battle of the Bulge, who lived in America and spoke American-type English, were a threat to the American soldiers, the GIs who were sent out to test whether or not these people were really American or German soldiers, they didn't ask them about the First Amendment or questions designed to expose their knowledge of the American political system. They asked them questions to demonstrate their knowledge or ignorance of American life and popular culture. This produced some interesting casualties. Britain's Field Marshal Montgomery waved aside the guards, who then shot out his tires. And the British actor David Niven, who had left Hollywood to become a commando in the war, well, he was asked by American soldiers who had won the 1943 World Series in basketball, replied, "I haven't the foggiest idea, but I did star with Ginger Rogers in Bachelor Mother." So quite a lot flows from that. Anyone can learn philosophical Americanism in a civic class. For a deeper knowledge and commitment, living in America is a far surer recipe. The philosophical understanding is a very thin identity compared to the full richness of an identity rooted in the lived experience of a particular society, particularly a particular free society. Nor does an attachment to liberal values, which is held to be the sign of a successful philosophical Americanism, nor does the attachment to liberal values distinguish Americans from the citizens of many democratic countries, especially other English-speaking countries. And there's a final paradox, which Chesterton hinted at. An American identity rooted in cultural familiarity and lived experience will be more genuinely liberal than one attached to rooted in the American idea as such. The cultural identity allows someone who is American to reject the dominant ethos of his society without losing his claim to be an American. Orwell gives a very good example from English life in the 30s. He says that a lot of people who had superficially hostile attitudes to Britain had absorbed Englishness by a kind of osmosis, by living in the society. So he gave the example of a Marxist professor of law who had written to object, a letter to the Times, to object to a government piece of legislation on the grounds that it was alien to the most sacred traditions of British law. Something, as a Marxist, he's supposed to believe is really just a form of disguised oppression. Oh, sorry. Don't worry, I'm coming to the end. All of which means that Americans are a distinct and recognizable people with their own history, culture, customs, loyalties, and other qualities that are wider and more various than the most virtuous summary of liberal values. And the final point is this, that if Americans are a distinct people, which I think they are, with their own history, traditions, institutions, and a common culture, then they can reasonably claim that immigrants should adapt to them and to their society rather than the reverse, which is multiculturalism. For most of the American Republic's history, that is what happened, and it happened because of deliberate public policy supported by a national consensus. In current circumstances, it would imply, for instance, that Muslim immigrants should adapt to American liberty as Catholic immigrants once did. If America is an idea, however, Americans are not a particular people, but simply individuals or several different peoples living under a broad liberal constitution. That vision of identity is inevitably a carrier of multiculturalism. For if Americans are not a particular people, then there is no justification for America's common culture to be privileged over the cultures of current and future immigrants. America, in those circumstances, would truly be a nation dedicated not to a proposition, but to a conjunction. And. Thank you.